Hey, Adam here. In my previous video I covered the strange disappearance of Casey Hathaway, and he managed to survive temperatures of up to -6 degrees Celsius for 3 days, and upon being found he stated that he spent some time with a bear in the woods who looked after him. Now I'm sure you can imagine the kind of speculation that this incident caused, and if you read the comments section of that video, a lot of people seem to be leaning in the Bigfoot direction, which was actually the motivation for this video. Now, I'm a person that doesn't really have a stake in the Bigfoot conversation at all. I'm not an advocate, I'm not an opponent. I'm just a neutral party, so it could make this quite interesting. And for those that are interested as well, there will be a little update on Casey's disappearance towards the end of this video. So I did some background research on the term Bigfoot, and Wikipedia states that the term first gained renown by a Wyandot chief who held that nickname in the 1830s, and that was simply because of the enormous size of his feet. And this is actually true. Here's a brief quote from the Indianapolis Indiana Journal on the 25th of May 1833 that references this particular chief. The adventurers had not followed the trail far before they became satisfied that the imprints were conducted by Bigfoot, a renowned chief of the Wyandot tribe, who derived his name from the immense size of his feet. His height considerably exceeded 6 feet, and his strength was represented as Herculean. Now, to be fair, while 6 feet is pretty tall, it was exceptionally tall back then because we seem to be getting taller as a species overall. Over the last 150 years, the average height of people has increased about 4 inches, so comparably, this would have been a very powerful chap in that time. There were other references of the name Bigfoot too, but let's skip forward a time. The term Bigfoot was actually used to describe 2 massive grizzly bears that weighed around 2,000 pounds each, which is well in excess of the average. And this actually may have been the inspiration for the name of the creature that we know today, real or otherwise. And most importantly overall here, the term Bigfoot became widely popular in relation to an ape-like creature in 1958. So with that in mind, I thought that it would be interesting to seek out what I could find before that time in relation to unusual sightings or experiences in the woods. So just weirdly enough then, why don't we start with the 26th President of the United States of America, Theodore Roosevelt, who served between 1901 and 1909. So there are many that didn't know this about Theodore, myself included, but he was an avid big game hunter. In 1893 he published the book The Wilderness Hunter, where he recounted many experiences whilst out in the wilderness. Now within this book, there was one incident that seemed to stick out as unusual. These are Theodore's words, and I quote, "It was told to me by a grizzled, weather-beaten old mountain hunter named Bauman, who was born and had passed all his life on the frontier. He must have believed what he said, for he could hardly repress a shudder at certain points of the tales. When the event occurred, Barman was still a young man and was trapping with a partner among the mountains dividing the forks of the Salmon from the head of Wisdom River. Not having had much luck, he and his partner determined to go up into a particularly wild and lonely pass through which ran a small stream said to contain many beaver. This pass had an evil reputation because the year before, a solitary hunter who had wandered into it was slain there, seemingly by a wild beast, the half-eaten remains being found afterwards by some mining prospectors, who had passed his camp only the night before. The memory of this event, however, weighed very lightly with the 2 trappers who were as adventurous and hardy as others of their kind. They then struck out on foot through the vast, gloomy forest, and in about 4 hours reached a little open glade where they concluded to camp as signs of game were plenty. There was still an hour or 2 of daylight left, and after building a brush lean-to and throwing down and opening their packs, they started upstream. At dusk, they were surprised to find that during their absence, something, apparently a bear, had visited camp and had rummaged about among their things, scattering the contents of their packs and in sheer wantonness destroying their lean-to. The footprints of the beast were quite plain, but at first they paid no particular heed to them, busying themselves with rebuilding the lean-to, laying out their beds and stores and lighting the fire. While Borman was making supper, it being already dark, his companion began to examine the tracks more closely, and soon took a break from the fire to follow them up, where the intruder had walked along a game trail after leaving the camp. Coming back to the fire, he stood by it a minute or 2, peering out into the darkness, and suddenly remarked, "Borman, that bear has been walking on 2 legs. Borman laughed at this, but his partner insisted that he was right, and upon examining the tracks with a torch, they certainly did seem to be made by but 2 paws or feet. However, it was too dark to make sure. After discussing whether the footprints could possibly be those of a human being, and coming to the conclusion that they could not be, the 2 men rolled up in their blankets and went to sleep under the lean-to. At midnight, Borman was awakened by some noise and sat up in his blankets. As he did so, his nostrils were struck by a strong, wild beast-like odour, and he caught the loom of a great body in the darkness at the mouth of the lean-to. He took a shot at the vague, threatening shadow, but must have missed, for immediately afterwards he heard the smashing of the underwood as the thing, whatever it was, rushed off into the impenetrable blackness of the forest and night. After this, the 2 men slept but little, sitting up by the rekindled fire, but they heard nothing more. In the morning, they started out to look at the few traps they had set the previous evening, and they put out new ones. By an unspoken agreement, they kept together all day and returned to the camp towards evening. On nearing it, they saw hardly to their astonishment that the lean-to had again been torn down. The visitor of the preceding day had returned, and in wanton malice had tossed about their camp, kit and bedding, and destroyed the shanty. The ground was marked up by its tracks, and on leaving the camp, it had gone along the soft sedge by the brook, where the footprints were as plain as if on snow, and after a careful scrutiny of the trail, it certainly did seem as if, whatever the thing was, it had walked off on but 2 legs. The men, thoroughly uneasy, gathered a great heap of dead logs and kept up a roaring fire throughout the night, one or the other sitting on guard most of the time. About midnight, the thing came back down through the forest opposite, across the brook, and stayed there on the hillside for nearly an hour. They could hear the branches crackle as it moved about, and several times it uttered a harsh, grating, long-drawn moan, a particularly sinister sound, yet it did not venture near the fire. In the morning, the 2 trappers, after discussing the strange events of the last 36 hours, decided that they would shoulder their packs and leave the valley that afternoon. All the morning they kept together, picking up trap after trap, each one empty. On first leaving camp, they had the disagreeable sensation of being followed. In the dense spruce thickets, they occasionally heard a branch snap after they had passed. And now then, there were slight rustling noises among the small pines to one side of them. At noon, they were within a short distance of camp. In the high, bright sunlight, their fears seemed absurd. The 2 armed men, accustomed as they were through long years of lonely wandering in the wilderness to face every kind of danger from man, brute or element. There were still 3 beaver traps to collect from in a little pond in a wide ravine nearby. Borman volunteered to gather these and bring them in, while his companion went ahead to camp and made ready the packs. Reaching the pond, Borman found 3 beavers in the traps, one of which had been pulled loose and carried into a beaver house. He took several hours in securing and preparing the beaver, and when he started homewards, he marked with some uneasiness how low the sun was getting. At last, he came to the edge of the little glade where the camp lay and shouted as he approached it, but got no answer. The campfire had gone out, though the thin blue smoke was still curling upwards. Near it lay the packs, wrapped and arranged. At first, Borman saw nobody, nor did he receive an answer to his call. Stepping forwards, he again shouted, and as he did so, his eye fell on the body of his friend stretched beside the trunk of a great fallen spruce. Rushing towards it, the horrified trapper found that the body was still warm. The footprints of the unknown beast creature, printed deep in the soft soil, told the whole story. The unfortunate man, having finished his packing, had sat down on the spruce log with his face to the fire and his back to the dense woods to wait for his companion. It had not eaten the body, but apparently had romped and gambolled round it in uncouth, ferocious glee, occasionally rolling over and over it, and had then fled back into the soundless depths of the woods. Borman, utterly unnerved and believing that the creature with which he had to deal was something either half human or half devil, some great beast, he struck off at speed down the pass, not halting until he reached the beaver meadows, where the hobbled ponies were still grazing. Mounting, he rode onwards through the night until far beyond the reach of pursuit. Theodore then acknowledged that this was not the first time he's heard of such a sighting, and he stated that he just didn't have enough verifiable information to continue further into that topic. So obviously this is an incident that relies solely on the testimony of Borman, but Theodore seemed to think enough about it to include it in his book. Now, this is quite a difficult area to research from a historical standpoint, Because in more recent times, if you wanted to do this, you've got the nice keyword of Bigfoot to play with. However, I wasted plenty of time using search terms such as ape-like. And the problem might not be obvious at first glance, but in the 1800s, many people genuinely may not have known what an ape looked like, since it's not as if they could just hop on Google and see them, you know, like we could today. And as a result, if one were to report seeing something out of the ordinary that matched that kind of description, it wouldn't necessarily be reported that way, if you see what I'm saying. What I did come across though was the term wild man, a lot actually. So in the 1800s, wild men were just being reported all over the place, you know, as people were venturing into wilderness areas. Their descriptions seem to vary a lot, and it actually gets somewhat strange because it seems to me that if true, people are referring to different things by the same name. For instance, I did find another account that was somewhat similar to the incident Theodore shared, but there are unfortunately far fewer details present, but you'll see what I mean here. So this incident was reported by the East Hampton Star on the 23rd of October 1886. This is what was said. 3 men were camping out in the woods about 100 miles north of Moosehead Lake. 2 of the campers were away from camp for a week and came back to find the body of their companion. They went for help and, reinforced by a dozen others, searched the woods for the unknown culprit. It proved to be a terrible wild man, 10 feet in height with arms 7 feet in length, covered with long brown hair. The party took aim and finally succeeded in putting the beast down. I can't help but feel like if someone had genuinely found this creature and put it down, then we would know about this today and we wouldn't be here talking about what Bigfoot is or isn't. You see what I mean? Here's another one though, which involved a wild man, but you'll notice the difference here almost immediately. This was reported by the Eminence Current Wave on the 8th of December 1887, so let's just get into it. For the past several days, the people of the little mountain hamlet of Mountain View, Passaic County, New Jersey, have been in a state of alarm and excitement over the appearance of a wild man in the woods near the town. Hunting parties were formed to capture him. They scoured the woods in every direction, but could find no trace of him. A few people who had seen him said that he was hatless, coatless, and dressed in tatters. Amazing. What did he look like? Well, he wasn't wearing a hat. Say no more, Chief. He had a wild expression in his eyes, his face was haggard, and in his form was emaciated. It is said that he lived on grass, acorns, and wild berries, and that he could climb trees and swing about on the limbs like a monkey. He was seen to pick up handfuls of grass and eat it. A large hunting party which scoured the woods say they tracked the wild man and after a long chase brought him to bay. He turned on his pursuers and fought with a frantic desperation. He seized the club and swung it about so that it was dangerous to get near him. At last, some of the hunters seized him. They had a desperate grapple with the man, who struggled with almost superhuman strength. Not till he was utterly exhausted were his captors able to overpower him. They bound him securely and took him to the town. The wild man could talk. He said, "I want grass. Give me some grass. I am hungry." He was easily pleased apparently. The wild man would say nothing else. Inquiries concerning who he was and why he lived in the woods brought no answer. He seemed to be about 30 years old and looked like a German. Okay. When his captors asked him how long he lived in the woods, he shook his head and replied, "Give me some grass." His garments were in tatters, and he seemed to be on the verge of starvation. His eyes were big and wild, his face was thin and haggard. As there was no jail in the little town to put him in, and as the inhabitants were all afraid of him, he was taken to Delaware and Lackawanna railway station and locked in a little shelter for a switchman. Station Agent Bean, great name, telegraphed to police headquarters at Patterson requesting that policemen be sent to Mountain View to take the wild man into custody. As the police of Patterson have no jurisdiction outside of the city, none could be dispatched on this errand. While the excited inhabitants of Mountain View were awaiting the arrival of the police, the wild man wrenched the wooden bars from the window of the little shanty where he was confined and jumped out. He ran for the woods with scores of people running and shouting after him. They kept up the chase across fields and through the woods, but the strange wild man ran with the speed of a deer. He reached the forest, plunged into the thicket and disappeared. The people of Mountain View are now more excited and alarmed than ever. They fear that the wild man may come into the town and make someone disappear, or damage property. He seems likely to pass away of starvation as the supply of grass is sensibly diminishing. An organised effort will be made to recapture him. So the first account there sounded rather odd, and perhaps something out of the ordinary, since the world's tallest man stands at around 8 feet and 11 inches. There's just no way that was a person, assuming of course that the truth is being told and that no exaggerations have been made, which I don't want to judge either way. The second incident, on the other hand, sounds a lot like they're describing a feral man who probably spent a large portion of his life in the wilderness. It's interesting that he could speak English though, and that could actually mean that he was once civilized. I'm not sure, but I do bet there's an interesting story to be told there. So I went even further back to the 1840s, and I found a letter from a missionary living in northern Washington. So this letter seems to have been preserved by the Holland Library of Washington State University. I've had to paraphrase a lot of this and leave some of the details out because honestly, if you read this, you'd probably cringe and have an aneurysm. But the context of this is that E. Walker was the missionary to the Spokane Native Americans, and he was writing back to the secretary of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. Here's what was said. Dear Sir, I suppose that it is not necessary for me to say as much as Mr. Eels has given you all that is interesting. My health is very poor, and I fear I shall be unable to pursue my labours as a missionary. It is, if I may judge, very difficult and will require much hard study before we have much knowledge and are prepared to make any direct appeal to the Native Americans. And just so we're absolutely clear here, he meant the potential use of force. I'm sure you know the history. Continuing, I should not be at all surprised if this mission proves to be a total failure. We, I fear, are destined to experience some opposition from the old chief I named in my last letter. He has been absent most of the time since. It has been very sickly in this region the last part of winter. Many have been lost. I do not know what can be done to save people. Something must be done quickly. I suppose you will bear with me if I trouble you with a little of their superstition which has recently come to my knowledge. They believe in the existence of a race of giants which inhabit a certain mountain to the west of us. This mountain is covered with perpetual snow. They inhabit its top. They may be classed with goldsmiths' nocturnal class, and they cannot see in the daytime. They hunt and do all of their work in the night. They are men stealers. They come to the people's lodges in the night when the people are asleep, and then they take them and put them under their skins and take them to their place of abode without even waking. When they wake in the morning, they are wholly lost, not knowing in what direction their home is. The account that they give of these giants will in some measure correspond with the Bible account of this race of beings. They say their track is about 1.5 feet long. They will carry 2 or 3 beams upon their back at once. They frequently come in the night and steal their salmon from their nets and eat the meat raw. If the people are awake, they always know when they are coming very near, by their strong smell which is intolerable. It is not uncommon for them to come in the night and give 3 whistles, and then the stones will begin to hit their houses. The people believe that they are still troubled with their nocturnal visits. We need the prayers of the church at home. I am, my dear sir, yours most truly, Elkanah Walker. That was certainly very odd, and honestly sounds like a lot of the encounters you hear about in more recent times. Lots of people claim to have had rocks thrown at or near them from afar, or have come back to a campsite that's been messed up. I think a good question might be though, how in the world does a massive primate sneak around and mess with people without being seen? I actually think that's the crux for a lot of people who look at this and they just think there's absolutely no way we wouldn't have more evidence by now. Although the Native Americans' description of these men stealers makes them sound highly coordinated and competent at whatever it is they're doing. I suppose you could argue that maybe their intelligence is being underestimated, and instead of viewing them as a sapient creature, we view them as more animalistic and maybe clumsy. Although I've got to say that when Walker spoke about these things just taking people who then awaken in an unfamiliar place, that gave me massive Missing 411 vibes. I'd love to have known more from the Native Americans in the area themselves. I'd just love to know what they reasoned about what was happening, because I have no doubt at all that they truly believe this was the case. Okay, so if you're into the Bigfoot topic, you're gonna love this next article that I found. and I really had to wade through a lot of crap before I dug this one up. This was reported by the Savannah Morning News on the 30th of November 1884. The title of this article reads, "Description of strange creature captured near Yale." This is what was reported. Actually, before we start this one, and I have tried to preserve this, but I did just want to say that whoever initially wrote this, while it is in English, it might as well not be. The way the sentences read, they might as well be in hieroglyphs because I just can't read them out like this. So as I say, I've rewritten a lot of this while trying to preserve everything from the original author. So I apologise in advance if I've missed any smaller details that may have passed me by, because good lord, honestly, my brain capitulated wholesale trying to make sense of this. Just know that when we're talking about these people ascending a mountain, they were on a train, and if you just keep that in mind, this will just make sense. Right, so let's get into it. In the immediate vicinity of the number 4 tunnel, situated some 20 miles above this village, lie bluffs of rock that were thought to be insurmountable. However, a Yale British Columbia correspondent of the British Colonist writes that they have been successfully scaled on Monday. Mr. Ondenmunk's employees, who arrived on the regular train from Lytton, they were assisted by Mr. Costerton, the British Columbia Express Company's messenger, and a number of other gentlemen from Lytton. Together, they set off east, and after considerable trouble and perilous climbing, they succeeded in capturing a creature which may truthfully be called half man and half beast. Jacko, as the creature has been called by its capturers, is something of the gorilla type, standing about 4 feet 6 inches in height and weighing 127 pounds. He has long, black, strong hair and resembles a human being, with one exception. His entire body, except his hands or paws and feet, are covered with glossy hair about 1 inch long. His forearm is much longer than a man's forearm, and he possesses extraordinary strength, as he will take hold of a stick and break it by wrenching or twisting it, which no man living could break in the same way. Since his capture, he is very reserved and only occasionally uttering a noise which is half bark and half growl. He is, however, becoming daily more attached to his keeper. His favourite food so far is berries, and for anyone who watches the channel a lot might find that to be interesting. Carrying on. He drinks fresh milk with evident relish. By advice of Dr. Hannington, raw meats have been withheld from Jacko, as the doctor thinks it would have a tendency to make him savage. The mode of capture was as follows. Ned Austin, the engineer, when in sight of the bluff at the eastern end of the number 4 tunnel, saw what he thought was a man sleeping in close proximity to the track. As quickly as possible, he blew the signal to apply the brakes. The brakes were instantly applied, and in a few seconds the train was brought to a standstill. At this moment, the supposed man sprang up and, uttering a sharp, quick bark, began to climb the steep bluff. Conductor R.J. Craig and express messenger Consterton, followed by baggage men and brakemen, jumped from the train knowing they were some 20 minutes ahead of time, and they immediately gave chase. After 5 minutes of perilous climbing, the then supposed demented creature was corralled on a projecting shelf of rock where he could neither ascend or descend. The query now was how to capture him alive, which was quickly decided by Mr. Craig, who crawled on his hands and knees until he was about 40 feet above the creature. Taking a small piece of loose rock, he let it fall, and it had the desired effect of rendering poor Jacko incapable of resistance for a time. The bell rope was then brought up, and Jacko was now lowered to a terra firma. I'm not sure what that is. After firmly binding him and placing him in the baggage car, the train started for Yale. At the station, a large crowd who heard of the capture by telephone from Spuzzum Flat were assembled, each one anxious to have the first look at the creature, but they were disappointed as Jacko had been taken straight to his present keeper. The question naturally arises, where did this creature come from? From bruises about its head and body and apparent soreness since its capture, it is supposed that Jacko ventured too near the bluff, slipped, fell and lay where he found until the sound of the rushing train awoke him. Mr. Thomas White and Mr. Gown, as well as Mr. Major, who kept a store about half a mile west of the tunnel for the past 2 years, has mentioned seeing a curious creature at different points between camps 13 and 17. No attention was paid to their remarks as people came to the conclusion that they had either seen a bear or a dog. Who can unravel the mystery that surrounds Jacko? Does he belong to a species hitherto unknown in this country? Where do you even start with that one? It was reported as being truthful and was covered by various press outlets. So they describe Jacko as being gorilla type and resembling a human, but sort of half man and half beast. You know, it does sound like you can rule out gorilla directly, and then at that point it does sound like something very unfamiliar. Again though, that's completely assuming that the journalists of that time were doing their jobs and they actually looked into the matter properly. That's obviously not something I can just ascertain from scouring through these papers. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that one too though, because I feel like there isn't something inherently obvious that could have been without getting weird. You could also make the argument that if they'd captured a Bigfoot all that time ago, we'd surely know about the species today. Surely, right? I'm not sure why something like that would just be hidden for reasons, I don't know. Now, there is one final way that you could perceive Bigfoot, though I'm not really sure how well this comparison works. People often talk about Bigfoot as being intelligent and highly coordinated, so I'm not sure how well that would fit the description of the Gigantopithecus. But these primates are now an extinct species that lived a long time ago, and identifications seem to have been found in southern China, Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia. The size of these creatures remain highly speculative, but those who are able to give an educated opinion seem to think that they weighed around 440 to 660 pounds. Now these things do genuinely look like the way Bigfoot is described. Again though, and of course, I don't really know how reasonable it is to be putting these sightings down to the Gigantopithecus. To my knowledge, there's never been any findings to indicate that these things were ever in the United States, which is obviously where a lot of Bigfoot sightings take place, though of course not exclusively to America. The only way in which it would make sense to view Bigfoot in this way would be to assume that small pockets of their population has managed to survive all around the world. Small enough so that they could hide deep within forests, but enough to be able to breed and preserve their species, really. And I suppose if this is the case, it might also make sense to assume evolution has worked in a similar manner to what we've seen with other creatures, and the Gigantopithecus may have gotten smaller, which surely must be true for them to be able to hide so well. That's obviously assuming that they're actually still here, which I personally doubt. But in 1946, a German anthropologist by the name of Franz Wiedenreich, he hypothesized that the Gigantopithecus must be at least double the size of a male gorilla. In 1957, a Chinese paleontologist, Pei Wenxiao, estimated that their height may have been around the 12-foot area. And just from historical reports that I've read, around 10 foot is what seems to have been described the most commonly. But at the end of the day, this is absolutely not my area at all, and there's just not really anything worthwhile that I could really add to it, Right, let's move on from that then, and let's have a look at the brief update that I found on Casey Hathaway. And I actually wish that I'd come across this information during the deep dive on the topic, because it would have been quite interesting. There were other viewers who mentioned this too, but I'd like to thank Angel Morningstar specifically, just for providing some links. Right, so I don't even know how to introduce this properly, but Casey disappeared 2 days after a fairy convention around 130 miles away in the Raleigh-Durham Research Triangle area. I don't pretend to have any real knowledge about fairies or anything like that, and I'm sure that people have a whole host of opinions, but I'm not looking to make fun of anyone or anything like that. Now, with that being said, looking at this, I'm sure that you can see the obvious implication here. Could a 3-year-old mistake someone in a suit like this as a bear? To me, I would say yes. I imagine there is a very good chance of that happening. I'd also like to make it plainly clear that I'm not making any accusations at all. This is purely a discussion and nothing more. As Sheriff Chip Hughes said, there was absolutely no evidence at all of Casey being taken out of the woods. And I'm telling you right now, if Sheriff Hughes felt like something like that had happened, he would have been all over it. If you go missing, you want a guy like Chip being involved in the search. Let's just put it that way. Anyway, so there are a couple of questions that need to be posed. First, what is the likelihood of someone from that event driving 130 miles to the remote location where Casey went missing? In my estimations, I imagine that would be very low, because in the end, nothing actually happened to Casey in terms of harm or any kind of experience that would cause trauma. I mean, don't get me wrong, he may suffer trauma from being lost like that, but I'm talking physical trauma. If anything bad had happened to Casey, there would have been clear evidence of that, and there just wasn't. Secondly, what would the motive have been here? Was the plan to just go into the woods with Casey, hang around for a bit, move around for 3 days, and then that's it? I'm going to come out and say that I don't believe that this was the case. The event ends, someone decides to stick around for 2 days, and then travels to this somewhat remote area dressed like a bear, and there's just not a single report of someone dressed like that, like a bear walking around. I just don't buy that. However, I fully appreciate and I expect this information to change some people's perception of the event, and if you're one of those, I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to see a bit of discussion on that, actually. I think it could be quite interesting. You know, I would have loved to have picked Sheriff Hugh's brain about this. It would have been great to have gotten his take on that. But anyway, that's the brief update on Casey, and it's a shame I wasn't able to include it in the original video, because I would imagine there would have been a bigger segment on this. But this really did need to be shared in relation to the incident, and perhaps I've just got a bad take on it. I'd like to hear someone else's take. Right, and with all that being said, I'm going to end this one here. So, thoughts on Bigfoot? Where do you stand? And just what's your opinion in general? And I'd just like to thank you for watching. And I'd just like to say a massive thank you to the patrons who give me the ability to read a metric crap ton for these videos, and I quite enjoyed doing the research, so thank you very much. If you liked the video, give it a like. If you disliked it, give it a dislike. I don't mind at all. I'm just looking for your honest opinion. And I hope that you've had a great day or evening, depending on where you are. And I'll see you next time. Cheers.